All right, it's live stream on CRCS YouTube already. Now we can begin. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Wednesday Forum. This is a weekly discussion that is held by both the Center for Religious and Cross-Cultural Studies, CRCS, a master's program at the Graduate School of Kacamata University. I'm Aziz Anwar, a staff member at CRCS. And this is also co-hosted by the Indonesian Consortium for Religious Studies, a doctoral degree program from the consortium of 3 universities in Yogyakarta, namely Gajah Mada University, State Islamic University of Sunan Kalijaga, and Duta Wacana Christian University. We have had already our speaker today, Ricardo Vargas Posada, Dr. Ricardo Vargas Posada, who just graduated from ICRS last year around September, and he finished he defended his dissertation and finished with honors from the ICRS with a dissertation topic that is going to be talked about today, and that is about the way female Catholics re-signify the concept of mission in the context of environmentalism facing neoliberal capitalism. Well, that is the title of the talk. And I believe Ricardo is going to discuss or compare two cases here between those in the Urabá region in Colombia and those in Manggarai region in Flores, eastern Indonesia. So I think we are going to look at how the female Catholics, struggle with the people to, I don't know, to fight against extractive corporates in each region. So Ricardo, you already know the way we manage this forum, right? So 40
That's right.
minutes maximum for your presentation, and then the next 45 minutes for discussion. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Ricardo.
Well, thank you very much, dear Aziz. Let me first start by sharing my screen. Please let me know if you're able to see it.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this great invitation. I have been an avid participant of the Wednesday forums since I joined the ICRS program. And I have learned a lot from the bunch of different presenters and guests that have joined the Wednesday Forum. So for me, it's an honor today to have been invited by you and by ICRS and CRCS to join today to share the findings of my dissertation, which, as you mentioned, I finished last year around mid-year, and I finally defended on August, at the end of August. So I'm gonna be talking about female congregations. Let me see if I can. Yep. I'm gonna be talking about female congregations, female Catholic missionary congregations in two spaces that are on the fringes of neoliberal capitalism. And my main interest was to find out how the concept of mission had been resignified in the last century, and how that specific concept of mission was being operationalized at these two spaces today. So it was a comparative research. Let me see if I can. It's not moving. Okay. So first, okay, so I have 40 minutes, right? Let me check that here so I don't take longer than expected. Okay, so there's some background trends for this study from different aspects of society. From an ecological perspective, we of course have what we all know today as the ecological catastrophe, not the ecological crisis, but the ecological catastrophe, as it has been renamed in recent years. And I don't think I have to deal long with this topic. We are all aware that it is perhaps the most pressing issue that we face today in the world. From an economic perspective, we have what has been termed green capitalism, or the capitalist system trying to incorporate either a green discourse, what has been termed as a greenwashing, or the system also it's getting involved in a overall rethinking of the system itself, what has been termed shareholder capitalism instead of stakeholder capitalism. So in order to take into account all the societal aspects and impacts that the system is producing and how to deal with that. So in terms of economics, green capitalism is one of the trends that was central to this dissertation. Identity politics, which had been rising steadily since the 70s and 60s as an important force in politics, and this dilemma between recognition and redistribution that was a very important topic the early 2000s, but still matters today. And what I understood from this debate is, especially after my field research, is that these topics of redistribution are not necessarily sidelined by recognition issues, but there was a reconfiguration that allowed downtrodden communities to advance both at the same time. Recognition to their identity in terms of indigenous populations, both in Indonesia and Colombia, and topics of redistribution, trying to lower the gap in terms of equality, wealth equality. The encyclical letter Laudato Si, in terms of the religious trend, specific to Catholic Christianity, which is the main religion that I deal with in this dissertation. And I don't think I need to elaborate a lot about this encyclical letter that has been so central, not only for the Catholic community, but at the policy level all around the world, because of what it says and of what it defends. So I think it's a very important aspect as well of the dissertation. And from a scholarly perspective, the trend of decoloniality, which might not be familiar to many of you, but which shares a lot of similarities with post-colonialism. The coloniality, although it's similar to post-colonialism, it tries to differentiate itself from it because it is not rooted on literary criticism or Indian authors living in the diaspora, but it was an academic trend that was started in Latin America mostly by scholars that were into social sciences, anthropology, sociology, and so on and so forth. We're talking about Mignolo, we're talking about Enrique Dussel, Walter Mignolo, I mean, Enrique Dussel, and the most important author for this dissertation, Arturo Escobar. among many other important authors. This trend has been very important, at least in Latin America, in the last decade. And I aim to share all the wealth of this academic trend through this dissertation. Okay, so I have two main aims, or I had two main aims with this research. The first one was, as I said before, to understand how the concept of mission had been resignified in the last century. That was my first aim. And the second aim was to explore the intercultural dialogue that is taking place nowadays between missionary congregations, female missionary congregations, at the frontiers of neoliberal capitalism in these two locations, the Flores Island in eastern Indonesia and the Urabá region in Colombia, and how and I wanted to explore this intercultural dialogue in terms of how both parties are affected by this dynamic, and how indigenous communities are impacted by Catholicism, which has been studied profusely by authors throughout the decades, but also how indigenous understandings had been influencing also Catholic thinking, not only at these spaces, but also at the centers of Catholic orthodoxy, as we will see later on. So first, let me introduce you to the core question of my research. I have just one core question and 5 subsidiary questions. So I will first start with this core question in order for you to get a better sense of where the dissertation was going. So how has the Catholic Church resignified in the last century the concept of mission at the frontiers of resource extraction in Indonesia and Colombia, characterized by a wide ethnic and religious diversity and determined by the dynamics of neoliberal capitalism and environmental degradation? First, a little introduction on the two loci that I took as samples for case studies for this research. This is the Indonesian Republic, as you all know, and Nusa Tenggara Timur, the province that I studied first. The first region, the first province that I selected for this research was Kalimantan Timur, is Kalimantan. But when I was conducted field research there, I realized that the Catholic population there was so small, and that the influence of the Catholic Church was so residual that it didn't have any leverage in order to advance specific agendas that matter to Catholic congregations or to the Catholic Orthodoxy. So after much hesitation and advice from my two advisors, Paberni and Padiki, I decided to switch to an area where Catholicism has been more central, and where Catholicism right now has a lot of leverage and can decide on a lot of issues. Let's say, for example, mining. That's a case study that has been amply documented, but where the Catholic Church plays a central role. So that's why I decided to switch to Western Flores. for my research. So this is the province of Nusa Tenggara Timur, as you all know, and the island of Flores. I based my research on the western part of the island, the Manggarai region, basically around Ruteng and around Rio on the northern coast of the western Flores Island. The Manggarai region, as I already explained in the core question, is a region that is characterized by wide ethnic diversity. Although the Manggarai people are overall the vast majority, around 90% on the Ruteng, there are also populations, Bajo populations, Bima people from Bima, Bugis, Javanese people as well, transmigrants from Java. And there's also a lot of religious diversity, although Catholics count for around 90% of the people. There are also other types of Christianity, there's Islam, and there's very important for my research traditional spiritualities that are still very important for Manggarai people and that have infused Catholicism with a particular flavor that it's very interesting to see. And in terms of resources that I mentioned here, because of destructivism that I mentioned in the first part of the presentation. Timber, rice, gold, and manganesium was the main element that was being exploited around Western Flores on the first part of the 20th century, and thanks to the lobby from the Catholic Church, from many members of the Catholic Church, especially from missionary congregations, this these mining ventures were stopped, and there was a moratorium for new mines to be open. So that was a very important aspect that was a background for my study. On the female congregation that I focus on in the Manggarai region is the SSPS, Servarum Spiritus Sancti, or Servants of the Holy Spirit. This congregation, it's centuries old congregation that was founded by Sir Arnold Jansen, the same German priest that founded the SVD congregation around the same time, the end of the 19th century. And although SVD arrived on the first around the 1920s in that region, in the Manggarai region, the SSPS took a little bit longer to arrive, and that set a particular path to the congregation that is different to the other congregation that I analyzed in the Colombian context, and which explains the differences, because there are a lot of differences between these two cases. But just an overall introduction of this congregation, very interesting and very important congregation for Manggarai region. These two pictures were taken in July 2019 while I was conducting field research in Ruteng. This is the ceremony of the ordination of new nuns, and this is a meeting that I was invited by the nuns to this ceremony, in which there was this school that belonged to a Protestant community from Jakarta that had been built by organization from Jakarta that was given to this congregation to administer. So this is the time of the ceremony when they were given the premises of this school in the rural area around Rutang to the nuns. Okay, now we focus on the other region of my research, which is not that familiar to you. This is the map of Latin America for those who are not that familiar with Colombia. Colombia is that country here in the northern western part of the hemisphere of the continent. And this is the Chocó Tumbes hotspot for biodiversity. This is something, a similarity that Chocó shares with Colombia shares with Indonesia. There's in Indonesia there are two biodiversity hotspots around the archipelago. Colombia has this very important one around the Chocó region is this one. And this is the province of Antioquia. This is the country Colombia. The province of Antioquia is the second wealthiest and most densely populated province in the country. But these regions with red, this is the Urabá region. These are not that well developed in terms of infrastructure or access to basic health or water. Pretty much like a lot of places in Western Flores. And like in the Manggarai region, this is an area that it's characterized by a wide ethnic diversity. The indigenous group in which I study were the Embera. The Embera, it's perhaps the largest indigenous group in Colombia nowadays in terms of demographics. But it's divided in different subgroups according to their geographic location. And the ones that I focus on were the Embera Eyávida, which are the ones who had been living for centuries in this region. But also this region, it's inhabited by a lot of different waves of migration from different regions. There's also Afro-Colombian people living there. There are also migrants from other provinces, not that wealth, not such wealth, not very wealthy regions such as Cordoba and Bolivar. And it's also home to a wide variety of religious denominations. Including the Embera spirituality, Christian Catholicism, and other branches of Christianity, such as Pentecostals, Evangelicals, or Adventists. The number of Muslims in Colombia is residual. There's less than 0.5% of Muslims in Colombia, so I didn't put Islam here because there's, especially in this region, spiritually non-Muslim presence. This picture was taken in one of the rural schools that these nuns visit. This school was headed by this woman and her husband in the back. They are indigenous leaders and teachers, and they were advancing with the help of the nuns this school that was entirely teaching them in their own language. And some of these kids had to walk like 2 hours each day to reach this school. So it's a very interesting experience. And here it's palm oil, especially, and cattle ranching and coca leaves cultivation, timber and gold, the main drivers of environmental exploitation in the region. Okay, so I think that's enough for contextualization. These are the Mother Laura missionaries, the female congregation I focus on in Colombia. It is a congregation that was founded by a seglar that later on became a nun. Her name was Laura Montoya. She recently was named a saint of the Catholic Church, the first saint that Colombia has. So she has become very, very popular in recent years. But the interesting thing about her congregation is that at that time, most of the congregations were European in nature. And this is a congregation that was founded by a Colombian woman and mostly composed of Colombian women. Then it started to expand through different countries. Now the congregation is present in 22 countries in 3 different continents, so it is quite large now. But at that time, at the beginning of the 20th century, it was a rather small and unknown new congregation by this so-called crazy women that were going to the fringes of society to evangelize the savages, as they called them before. And these 2 pictures were taken at the village of El Pital, the village where they first settled, the first group of nuns. There were 7 nuns that arrived in this village. At that time, it was covered with mangroves and different types of trees. Right now, due to cattle ranching, the environment it's rather different. And this painting is from the main city of the region called Dabeiba. Dabeiba. It's there are a lot of elements in this region that celebrate this nun, although it is a contested memory because of all the things that characterized Catholic evangelization at the beginning of the 20th century. Okay, so as I mentioned before, there's one basic core question that addresses the main issues that interest me in this topic, but there are subsidiary questions that I address in each of the individual chapters of the dissertation. And this first subsidiary question I address in the first 2 chapters. One I devoted to Flores, and the other one I devoted to Urabá, and is through reading of texts, of missionary texts from these 2 either congregations or spaces. I try to trace ideas that were seminal to the drastic changes that these congregations and that the Catholic Church experienced afterwards, especially after the Second Vatican Council. So here are 2 very important books for my dissertation. This is the first number of the journal Anthropos, which was founded by Father Wilhelm Schmidt, an SVD priest, who was also an anthropologist. And we can say that thanks to him and to other SVD missionaries from the early 20th century, there was a growth in the interest on ethnography, the study of languages, indigenous languages by SVD missionaries, and that helped a lot throughout the century to understand and to incorporate elements of the Manggarai spirituality in this specific context. I'm putting this this magazine here because I took the text that I took from this context is from this first number of the Anthropos, which is by Father Alexander Leroy, who is himself not an SVD missionary, but whose ideas were central to SVD interpretation of mission at that time. Father Leroy was a major missionary figure of the late 19th century. He was a missionary in East Africa, and his ideas on mission are very clear side compared to the practices that were being undertaken at that time. So it's interesting to compare what he was saying to what was being done at the time. And this other book, Missionary Letters, this is the Spanish title. It was written by Mother Laura. Here we see an original picture of her. In later years, she became um, very very fat, and it was very it's well known by this by her size. She had a lot of problems with diabetes and had a lot of suffering of body suffering that did not deter him to keep on working with this indigenous communities. And in this text, I did the same type of research using critical discourse analysis as exposed by Norman Fairclough in order to trace progressive stances on mission from the early 20th century. And I did find a lot of interesting input regarding this. We can later talk about with more detail in the question section. Okay, second subsidiary question is, what are the effects of social-political and economic and cultural factors on religious change among the Manggarai and the Embera Ayavida? And what I found is that these two locations have a very different relation with Catholicism, and that was a very interesting trend to study. Why do people in Manggarai accepted Catholicism so open-heartedly, and right now it's such an integral part of the Manggaraian identity, that of being Catholic, that it is a common saying there that to be Manggaraian is to be Catholic, and to be Catholic is to be Manggaraian. But it's the opposite in the Embera region, because I did not see any incorporation of Catholicism in Embera spirituality. And I had very interesting conversations with anthropologists, Colombian anthropologists that are have dedicated their lives to the study of these communities, and they share my views, because I was very hesitant at the beginning. I was like, I don't see any Catholic elements here. Where are they in the Embera spirituality? But I was confirmed by them that the presence of Catholicism among these people is very marginal. So I try to explain, first to understand and then to explain these different dynamics in these two locations, because missionary activity has been prevalent for more than a century, and these places have shared a lot of, as I explained before, a lot of this exploitation dynamics by economic ventures, and are forgotten by the central government. And these places, the Catholic Church being a main source of public good throughout the decades, but the relation to indigenous peoples have been very different. So I took a religious ritual that is central to Catholicism, which is the Mass, in order to address, to understand in situ in this loci, how do Catholicism interacts with local culture. This is a mass in Mukun village in Manggarai, in rural Manggarai. It's celebrating, the celebration is called the Penti celebration, which takes place after a person passes away, and sometime afterwards the family congregates, family and friends, and there's some animals slaughtered, some cattle and pigs slaughtered, And it was very interesting to see how Catholicism and indigenous spirituality were mingled in one very interesting ritual. Um, and this is a mass. Sorry, I kept the word in Spanish. Is mass at El Pital village in Dabeiba. And it was very difficult for me to share with indigenous and better indigenous people their rituals, because they are not very open to outsiders on that. I didn't enjoy the leisure of like a long stay ethnographic research there that had allowed me to start to gain some of their trust. But uh, anyhow, they don't have masses organized by Embera people. This mass was organized by the religious congregation of the Laurites in order to celebrate 100 years of presence in that region. And they invited a lot of people from the neighboring villages. Some of them did attend, but they were mostly women, and they were most of them at the back of the space. In this picture, we can see just one indigenous woman compared to, and there's another one here on the front. On the back, I didn't take, I didn't have that in the picture, but on the back we can see there's a lot, many other women, but they were not very active participating in the mass. Whereas in the Mukung village, women, men, kids, all people, they were all participating, chanting, celebrating. So it was a very drastic difference that I see in these two locations regarding how these two indigenous communities related to the Catholic Mass. Uh, Third question, the concept of development was very central to me, because not only the concept of mission changes, but also the concept of development changes. And I have seen how, especially missionary congregations, have re-understood the concept of development, not in terms of what is exposed by the central governments or international donors or the dynamics of the capital, but more, and this has been more recent in the last 30 years or so, to understand development in their own terms, in the terms of the communities that lived in that location. So not only development, but the social practices that are derived from it. And that was also very interesting, because that is the final part of the dissertation, in which I engage with how uh, the mission is understood and undertaken today. This is pastoral work being done by this congregation of Lauritas in Colombia. This is a school. It took us 1.5 day to arrive to this village. I was traveling with this nun. This nun goes every 2 months to different villages around the region. They're very spread out and very far in between. So it's difficult for her, and she has to cross. I mean, this is the jungle back here. It's not a very nice environment to be walking all day long in order to reach these villages and to share with the little kids um, education. And she knows the Embera language, although she's indigenous, but she is from the Sinu ethnic population, which is very, very different from the Embera. And here, that was a very interesting meeting that we had while I was there. This is Laurita nun, but we have here a space for the ex-guerrilla fighters from the civil conflict in Colombia, a civil conflict that engulfed the country for more than 6 decades and still continues until today, despite the fact the major guerrilla group signed a peace treaty with the government. Here we have the guy with the hat, was the main guerrilla leader of that region. He has already left the guerrilla, and has joined society. And this is the major from the army. There were also presence from the police, and we were all here sitting down, sharing about how it was, because they were enemies, well-known enemies, how they passed from being enemies to become um, co-citizens, and that was, they all agree, thanks a lot to the agency of these women, these Catholic nuns. It was a very interesting meeting that I had the fortune to attend with them. Pastoral work in Indonesia. Here is this in the Manggarai region. Here there's a meeting with young couples that are either living already as married couple without the um, without getting married yet, because that's traditional. Here in Manggarai, sometimes people don't wait until they get married. So the nun here, she's an activist, and especially she has focused on reproductive rights and HIV, which is a central issue right now for society in Manggarai, because there are a lot of migrant workers that go to other countries and come back being infected with AIDS, and they had been infecting many members of the community. So she was raising awareness of the dangers of HIV, and it was a very interesting meeting. This was the same day with other two nuns from the same SSBS congregation. One problem that I um, realized while I was there is that SSBS is not as strong on environmental issues as uh, the Laurita uh, nuns in Colombia are. So that was a problem that I had to face, and that's why I later had to rely on the work of um, Franciscan priests that were very, very active, or had been very active for decades, um, on environmental issues on Manggarai, in order to cover that aspect from religious engagement with indigenous communities and with environmental issues. The subsidiary question, number 4, this is very interesting because it's how these environmental discourses that are emerging at this in this spaces relate to the indigenous worldviews. And this, it's something that I think is more creative, and the more the part in which my work is more interesting for scholarly research, because I managed to find how indigenous worldviews were impacting the way Catholic missionaries understand their relation to the environment and their role in reversing this environmental situation which we are confronting today. So this is the OFM, the Franciscan brothers that I told you just told you about. They have been very, very active with indigenous communities and with the community as a whole. Right now, I will say that most Catholic religious congregations in Manggarai have environmental issues at the center of their concerns, but they had been doing that for decades. So that's what's relevant from them. And they're very, very conscious, very passionate, very activist. For example, we can see here the Eco Pastoral and Laudato Si on their shirts. So that stresses the importance of the encyclical letter. So this dissertation has two axes: temporal axis, in which I cover 1 century and try to understand how missionary activity has changed in this 100 years, but also a vertical axis in which I first explore these environmental issues at the grassroots level, and then see if that impacts the center of Catholic Orthodoxy, and that's the role that Laudato Si plays in this dissertation. in the last chapter, I analyze how, according to my findings and according to my literature review, how these realities at the grassroots level are impacting the centers of the orthodoxy. Basically, because what I saw on the on Laudato Si, now to finish because we have also 40 minutes, it's the work of Leonardo Boff. It's central when you read Leonardo Boff, and then you read the encyclical letter, you see a lot of similarities. So Leonardo Boff, it's a Brazilian priest that has been working with indigenous communities and down-trodden populations in Brazil for decades, and has been at the forefront of Catholic thinking on environmental issues. So that was one thing. The other is what I call in the theoretical framework Amerindian Perspectivism, which was first advanced by Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, a Brazilian anthropologist, which explains how indigenous populations in America understand their relation with non-human living beings. So that has also permeated. I also saw that on Laudato Si, and we can later talk on that on the question section. Arturo Escobar, I also mentioned him before as the main author from the decoloniality trend that I first mentioned to you. I have also the conclusions to share with you on my findings, but I think that will have to wait until maybe some of you want to ask about that. It is all from me. Thank you very much for your time, for listening. I'm all ears to your questions.
All right, thank you so much, Ricardo, for the presentation. And now let's have discussion here. For those of you who want to ask or comment, you may write down your questions in the chat box in this Zoom, or for those of you who are watching via YouTube, you may also write down your questions in the comment section of our YouTube channel. Or if you will, you may also turn on your video and I will let you to speak. Are there any one who wants to ask or give comments? But perhaps, Ricardo, from what you presented, I think most of the presentation revolve around your core questions and your subsidiary questions. But I think we haven't got enough time to listen to your answers to these questions, right? I think just a bit about the answer of your question. I mean, the core of your question about what you said early in the beginning of your presentation, the resignification of the concept of mission. How has that changed? I mean, many people would assume that mission means to convert people to join the Catholic faith. But you connect that concept in this research with the environmentalist activism, both in Manggarai and in Urabá in Colombia. So has there been a change in the way Catholic, especially the female congregations that you do research on, uh, give a new meaning to that concept?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Assis. That's such a great question, and I didn't have enough time to deal with it at length in my brief presentation. But yes, to give you first brief answer is yes. The concept of mission has experienced a profound resignification in the last, especially in the last decades, and especially after the changes propelled by the Second Vatican Council. Having said that, I also mentioned during the presentation that I could find some aspects, some progressive aspects of this new understanding of mission in the writings of these two authors from the early 20th century. So it's not something that it came out of the blue in 1962, or suddenly these priests and nuns were illuminated with novel interpretations of the mission. But it's a longue durée process that takes a lot to materialize, but that scholars have specifically pointed out at the Second Vatican Council as the main point of departure from where these different acceptions of mission and different understandings start to arise. But to give you an example, during the 70s and 80s, missionary congregations, many joined guerrilla groups in Colombia, following the theology of liberation. And at that time, there was a fracture between, the hierarchy of the Catholic Church in Latin America and these congregations that were usually working on these spaces, the social spaces that were not enjoying and the favors the fruits of capitalism, which to be true is most of the people in Latin America. It has been reduced, those numbers, in later years, although with the COVID pandemic it has reversed greatly. But if you ask one of these nuns today what do they understand by mission, it is very interesting, because the usual thing that most of us think, and the the prejudices with which I arrived to this research, were that, as you mentioned in your question, mission, the aim of mission is to convert someone to your religion. But it must be said, of course, that the Catholic Church is a huge institution, and there are a lot of different interpretations and points uh, on mission. But it was very consistent. It was a very consistent answer that mission was to walk together, to be a helping hand. I was very surprised, because many nuns said to me, "We don't try to convert anymore. We have finally realized the value of indigenous spiritualities. So what we're doing with the mission," because I said to them, "So what's the point of being a missionary if you're not trying to convert someone?" And they were saying, "We are here as a helping hand. We are here someone who listens, a shoulder to rely on when you need help." So it drastically changed my interpretation of what mission is. I read also recently an article at the New Yorker on some missionary nuns in Brazil, and they were very progressive, and they were saying that they thought about conversion as an abomination. Basically, they said they're trying to convert these people with such a sophisticated system of spirituality and society and social organization, to try to convert them to Catholicism is an abomination. So I focus on female congregations because when you read the literature, they're almost everywhere, they're absent. Nobody talks about the role of female missionaries. Everyone talks about the role of priests. But when I went to talk with these women, they were like, "We were there." For example, when I was in Rutang, and there were, of course, this very important, this watershed moment for the Catholic Church in Flores, is when they decided to side with the peasants that were suffering from the environmental degradation that the mining corporations, both Indonesian and foreign corporations, were um, uh, having on their land. when I was asking the SSPS nuns, they were like, "We were there with them. We were at the forefront of the protests, defying the police." But when you read the literature, you only read about the priests. So that was also very interesting, and that also made me more stern about the necessity of highlighting the role of these nuns.
Thank you, Ricardo. Pak Suhadi is going to say something from Australia. Monggo, Pak.
Yes, thank you, Mas Aris, and also thank you for Ricardo. That's quite nice presentation, Ricardo. Thanks for that. I have two short questions. One is, do people there in the grassroots, especially in Manggarai, they talk about when they advocate environmentalism, do they refer to Franciscan teachings? I mean, Francis of Assisi, which is not easy movie for modern people like now, or they mostly use Laudato Si, the Pope Francis encyclical, or I don't know whether. So my question here is actually trying to trace them the theology of Francis of Assisi, whether that's quite lively talked by people at the grassroots level among these religious leaders and also the lay people there, the activists there. The second question is related to the dynamic of diocese of Ruteng. Of course, advocating environmentalism is not easy. It gives quite high risk in the field. Could you explore or explain to us about the dynamics, whether they are in the same line in advocating environmentalism, or there are also dynamics within Catholic Church? Those people who are advocating, such as those people from GPIC, from Justice, Peace, and Integrated Creatures, the group which is quite strong advocating mining, etc., or whether they get support totally full support from the diocese also. Thank you, Ricardo.
Thank you very much, Pasuhadi, for your presence here and for your questions. Very interesting questions. I will try my best to answer to both of them. First, regarding environmentalism in Manggarai and the sources for the ideological sources or the main figures behind this movement. I must say that Francis, it's present mostly for the OFM, which is, of course, and understandably so, their founding father, the figure for Catholic environmentalism, but mostly were Franciscan brothers the ones who named Francis of Assisi as their influence, as their role model. In other congregations, maybe perhaps it was mentioned and passing on a conversation, but his influence was not as central as for the Franciscans. That's contrary to Laudato Si. Laudato Si has become a buzzword in recent years, and everyone was on the same boat, knowing what Laudato Si, perhaps after reading it or talking about it with fellow brothers or sisters, everyone was engaged with Laudato Si, and they were very vocal about the role of Laudato Si in advancing environmentalism in Ruteng. So to answer your question, both figures are present, but St. Francis mostly for his congregation, for the OFM. GPIC, of course, plays a central role in the raising awareness of environmental issues in Flores. And to talk about to to link it with your second question about the diocese of Ruteng, it is very interesting to see the exact moment in which environmental issues start to take a central role for the diocese, and that it's because I was looking at the books that they publish each year. I forgot the name of this, compilations of the basic issues that are central to them. And because I had the opportunity, people that were very open, very willing to share their insights on different topics. And I realized it was only at the end of the 20th century, 1998, when environmentalism enters the stage in Ruteng. That is very different from what happens in Colombia, because in Colombia you can trace that presence of environmentalism back to the 70s. But that's because of the internal dynamics of each location, in which I mentioned before, the fracture between the hierarchy of the church and the grassroots congregation. A lot of political also dynamics that, for example, in Indonesia, the role of the Catholic Church is so weak that it had to abide to the alignment of the central Indonesian government in order not to jeopardize its position, its political position in the specific context of Flores, which is very different from the Colombian context, in which the Catholic Church has an immense power and leverage. So there are different dynamics that led the Diocese of Ruteng to be a latecomer in the environmental fight, or the environmental or environmentalism. But after that, and especially after the fight against the mining corporations, it became central for the dioceses of Ruteng. And every person that belongs, the diocesan priests that I talked to, they have environmentalism as a core interest right now. So there's a central and decisive support from the hierarchies of the Catholic Church nowadays in these issues.
Okay, Pak Suhadi, don't you want to add something? No. All right. There is, yeah, Pak Suhadi. No, there is one question on the chat box, but before that, I will let my Jeping first to ask question to
Aziz.
Yes.
May I ask several questions?
Later, yeah, after this one.
Okay.
All right.
Hi, Ricardo. I guess I need to speak in English. The first, when I see your poster, is like environmentalism from below. What is it? But then it is really inspiring what you talk about, how indigenous people value actually influence the church, because for me is I also it's give me a reflection about why religion is difficult to like support people who try to protecting environments, especially for example in Muslims. It's difficult also to find like the religion leaders, some of them even moderating the people resistance actually. I just thinking, I think it's important they learn from church in Manggarai and Ruteng. I think this moment is important because under the the climate crisis and environmental crisis, the religion, I mean the leaders need to rethinking about the method and even the way how they discuss with people, because the conversation is mostly about our relation with the God, something like that, but not really kind of in the context of how we respond together the environmental crisis, things like that. That's the first. Thank you for that. And the second, My research at the moment is in Kalimantan, Central Kalimantan, especially in the Kaharingan community, which is, I just want your talk about how about there is historical when they have the Kaharingan religion, which is close with nature, and then changed to Christian. So it's actually make them really spiriting with the nature, actually. It's really interesting the way how the nuns, for example, said that, like you mentioned about how they respond in the context of changing religion is kind of that. Could you explore, or maybe, I don't know what you think about, because it's really clear how it's influenced people relation with the nature when they change to new religions. I mean, like Islam and Christian, something like that. And it's not really help how people actually at the moment fight with the environmental problems things. So I don't know what you insight about that actually. How the religion leader need to opening their mind and learn from indigenous people, because some of their faith or their practicing also is less at the moment. For example, like relation with the river, kind of that. So that's the second. The third is about the coloniality. I follow one of Walter Mignolo discussion about the coloniality, which is similar with the post-colonial, but it's actually different because the coloniality, I think, is important for the nation that have experience of colonialism. That's why it's put the coloniality and modernity in the same, together. So I think I agree with you that the coloniality, modernity is important to bring to Indonesia in the context to not really follow, what the progress is just, what you call it, economic growth things. We need to find the different way how it means development or something like that. So it's like more critical things in the context of development and not follow the same pattern of the West, for example, to use the economic growth as main indicator for the progress kind of that. Thank you.
Well,
Yes.
thank you very much. Well, Aziz, were you going to say something?
Nothing. Yeah. Yes. There
Well,
are still
thank you very
three
much.
people here who want to
Okay.
ask me. Yeah.
But my Jibing, thank you very much for your input. I think your comments were very, very interesting. You touched on different topics that could leave us here talking for hours. I will briefly address your comments, which I found very enticing. First, regarding the role of religious change or religious conversion, environmentalism. That was the first way to relate to religion and environment, especially in context in which missionary activity, as understood before, had been taking place. That is, in places where you have indigenous populations with their own spirituality, assuming these new dynamics, these new religious dynamics. I will mention just briefly Syed Hussein Nasser, which since the 60s has been from the Muslim side advancing environmental issues. So it's important not to lose sight of the different initiatives that different religions have been undertaken, and very well studied, at least in UGM, ICRS, and CRCS, the topic of eco-pesantrins in around Yogyakarta or around Java. I think in Kalimantan also right now there are several initiatives going on which are promising and that address this issue that you mentioned before about the role of religious leaders influencing their people. I think you touched on a very interesting topic: is how indigenous spirituality impacts religious leaders from the so-called world religions, and that was, I think, the one of the most fascinating parts of my dissertation for me as a researcher, in terms of the insights that I gained from that. And it's going back to Viveiros de Castro, in the Colombian context, in which Catholicism has not managed to pervade the spirituality of the indigenous people. It has happened the contrary. The religious missionaries have begun to learn how to see the world in the indigenous perspectives. I have the chance to talk to many different nuns that had lived for extended periods of time with indigenous populations in faraway places, in the Amazon basin or in the Congo region. I'm talking about like 10, 12 years among indigenous populations, and for them, their whole understanding of their relation to their environment had drastically changed. So it was very interesting to me to see how, because Catholic thinking has been very, proud, and have seen other cultures traditionally not as equals, but as inferiors that it needs to teach and to bring into the fore of Catholicism. That has changed, as I explained before, drastically in the last decades. And right now, we're starting to see a leveling ground between this former ideas of grandeur that existed and that still pervade many of the echelons of the Catholic hierarchy, but that has been significantly transformed at the grassroots level. So I think that is very interesting. Also, in the case of Manggarai, when I was talking with the brothers, the Franciscan brothers, they were like, if we don't if we don't understand, if we don't explain to the peasants environmentalism in terms of their own indigenous spirituality, we won't have any legitimacy with them. We have to and for them it's very easy, because in the context of Colombia, most of the nuns are not indigenous. In Manggarai, most or many of the members of these organizations are also Manggarai themselves. So for them, that that change is not that difficult, because they say, okay, it's my own spirituality that I inherited from my grandparents. So it's not difficult for them to understand. But what is important here is that in order for them to gain legitimacy with the population, they have to explain these concepts in the spiritual terms of their own a spiritual tradition. So that's, I think, very, very interesting. And finally, I don't want to take longer with these comments. I just found them very, very, very interesting and enticing. Going to the topic of the coloniality, which is the reason why I decided to devote part of the theoretical framework on it, is because I think, as you agree, based on your input, is that although post-coloniality and decoloniality share a lot of similarities, it is very centrally very important the points that the colonial authors are raising. Just one point to give you an example: post-coloniality was born after Edward Said's seminal book on Orientalism. And thanks to him, we learned to see the other of the European as the Middle Eastern, the Arab, the Muslim Arab from the Middle East, basically on the 17th, 18th, 19th century. I think it's mostly 18th, 19th century on Said's book. But what Walter Mignolo, going back to your author, the author that you mentioned, for him, the creation of the other, of the European, goes back in time at the time of the discovery of the Americas, when the first explorers start confronting themselves to a new society that they didn't even know it existed. First, they were confused and thought they were arrived to India. So he's taking back this construction of the European other and this idea of the coexistence of the exploitation of vast numbers of the world's population and the rise of modernity at the same time cannot be sidelined. So this is an important insight that the colonial thinkers provide, and I think it's very relevant for our studies nowadays. Thank you very much for your comments.
Thank you. Because the time is limited, I will give time to ask question for Mas Wiwit, but we suggest you just one concise question. It's already past midnight in Colombia. So I think Ricardo needs to sleep. Yeah, Mas Wiwit.
Okay. Thank you very much for opportunity, Mas Aziz and Pak Ricardo Vargas. I really appreciate your presentation. It's really valuable for me. Actually, I'm interested in the discussion about the discourse of environmentalism in the practice level. As I know that there is a contestation, there's a debate how to be a pro-environmental, pro-nature, I mean, because environmentalism think that they have to be life simply to accordance with the nature, but there are another school of thought that feel that it's not completely right. There is eco-modernism. It's a school of thought that feel that they believe that the problem of environment, the crisis of ecology is cannot be solved by living simply, but we have to advance our technology that can live. We can extract the result from nature, but we don't harm the nature. That's kind of idea from eco-modernism, and they think that they pro to modernity. So there are two kind of discourse that exists in how people deal with the crisis of ecology. So I would like to know actually, is there any this kind of conflict or debate in the local people in the Colombia or Manggarai who would like to try to make a harmony with nature, but they don't have such kind of guidance how to do that, and I would like to know how the religion, Catholicism, or maybe another religion, react to this kind of matter. I think that's enough. Thank you very much, Pak Ricardo and Mas Aziz.
Yeah, I think it's about eco-modernism and other ideas from other schools of thought, if any. Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Yes. Please, Ricardo.
Thank you very much, Mas Wiwit, for an interesting question. Very, very interesting, this trend of eco-modernism that you're mentioning. I must stress that these places in which I conducted research tend to be very far from the centers of industrial development. So there exists a wide gap between what we conceive from the city centers as our relation to nature, our relation to modernity, our relation to capitalism, to how people at the margins of the system who do not enjoy the benefits of the system, who have been exploited and dispossessed for centuries, how do they react or relate to modernity, to capitalism, or to westernization. So since I focus on the grassroots level, there's not that much talk about how modernity and or capitalism can engage with environmentalism. Is more like a way to rethink social relations in order to circumvent the dynamics of capitalism, in order to properly address the environmental issues that these communities faced. Having said that, I think that what you're saying is very interesting, because we cannot be oblivious of the benefits that modernity has brought to many sectors of society. And if we want to be fair, if we apply these transformations in these locations, most probably they will have a positive effect as well. So instead of feeling like anarcho-primitivists that they reject all relation to modernity, I think that this trend that you're mentioning, eco-modernism, has a lot to provide in terms of insights or possibilities. I mentioned at the beginning of the talk of green capitalism and the two main roads that it has taken. One that is called greenwashing, or just like branding your company as a green enterprise and keep doing business as usual, or other um, uh, enterprises that are being more innovative in their approach and are willing to reassess the impact of capitalism on societies and say, okay, capitalism has provided a lot of well-being for many in the world and not for that many. How can we share the wealth? How can we be more like optimized resources in such a way that the current environmental catastrophe can be reversed? Those are topics that we're not going to solve here, because those are huge debates. There are people that say capitalism we need to go beyond capitalism in order to properly address the environmental situation. Others might say, no, we need to readapt, to rethink capitalism that has been the most successful economic system we have known so far in order to advance the well-being of global societies. So I think it's very interesting what you mentioned, but since I focused on grassroots initiatives, their input is basically against these capitalist forces. Thank you very much, Wiwit, for your question.
All right. Last two questions in the chat box, and I think you can answer this at once, Ricardo. One from TG Sada. He or she, I'm not sure. Ask, 3 years ago, I studied a Buddhist missionary in a Muslim village. They also did not convert anyone, and the reason is also the same. We came there to help. However, I feel that they have some conditions, maybe negotiations with local imams. I may say that Buddhist monks can run their activities there as long as they do not convert the locals in order to maintain relations with the imams. What is your idea on this? And the last question from above T.G. Sada's question, from John Muhammad. This is a nice name. He asked, Despite the complicated electoral administration issues, in 2017, we had the experience of failing in trying to nominate clean senators from predominantly Catholic regions. Any suggestions for us? And could you tell us about the role of Alianza Verde in Colombia? John from Green Party of Indonesia.
Well, thank you very much to T and to John for such interesting questions. I don't know if I have answer to any of them, but I can share my thoughts on these two issues. I experienced to address the Jasada's input. I experienced something similar. There's the need to preserve communication in good terms among all residents of any given community. So you have to be very clever and very respectful of the feelings and religious convictions of other people. So I experienced the same. People were not trying to convert, and the regional leaders, this is especially in the case of Colombia, where Catholicism has not advanced in these indigenous communities. The local leaders, the shamans that are function as kind of like authorities, communal authorities, they were very open to the presence of nuns that were not willing to convert people. And the nuns at the same time knew that they were being accepted because of the material gains that they had to offer to the communities, because they very often came with health services, education services. Differently, the way they used these strategies before, as I said, although, as I mentioned before, Catholic Church is not a monolithic institution, and I still talk to many nuns that said that spirituality, indigenous spirituality, was evil, plainly evil. I received those comments. But to go back to the topic that we're addressing, yeah, you need to be very careful in joining or relating to any given community, even if your understanding of mission does not entail the transformation of the religious landscape of the person, but just aims to fulfill a personal obligation that your religion is giving you, which is to help the other, to be a brother to the other in need. So yeah, I experienced exactly the same situation, and it's very interesting. If you could share any additional information of that research that you previously done, I will be very interesting in hearing you or reading any article that you have produced from that research. And addressing John Muhammad question, I don't know. I'm not familiar with the green senators or that were running for office in Indonesia in 2017, so I cannot give any input on that. I will talk about the Green Alliance, or the Alianza Verde, which has been steadily growing in recent years as a central political force in Colombia. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily related to their green agenda, but mostly because their politicians are positioned at the center of the debate. Colombia has been traditionally a very right-wing type of state. There's not a single left-wing politician that has been in office since its independence. And recently, left-wing politicians are also gaining ascendancy. So the right is extremely afraid of them. So there's a lot of black propaganda between right and wing factions in the Colombian politics. So Alianza Verde, that finds itself at the center left has been able to capitalize on this division and to get a lot of the voting from any given side of the equation, and has been able to raise. But that, I will say, is not mainly due to their progressive green agenda, which is, I will say, rather conservative, considering the impact that the environmental catastrophe is imposing on us right now. Thank you very much for both of your questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Ricardo. We are grateful for your willingness to share your ideas, your research from your dissertation to the public. And well, if this were offline and you were in Jogja, there would have been, giving some token of appreciation to you, as you usually saw during the Wednesday forum, but because of the condition of the pandemic, that wouldn't be possible. So yeah, once again, we thank you for your sharing of your ideas, and for those of you who still want to join our weekly forum, for the next week we will have another topic titled "Morality on the Digital Age: Social Media Usage and Religious Authority Among Indonesian Muslim School Girls," and the speaker is Claire Marie Hefner from the Department of Religion, Florida State University. So we hope that we can see you again next week. Good afternoon, everyone, and stay healthy.
Thank you very much, Assis, and thank you very much to all of you